All right, so as Julian said, I am Ben Kane, and I'm one of the co-founders of Steel Crate Games, and we make a game called Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. The other co-founders of Steel Crate are Brian Fetter on the left there, wearing the headset, and Alan Pestalozzi. They're both around here somewhere, so you can find them throughout the weekend. We are all programmers, and we also do design, and we do business, and we do marketing, but we don't do art. We have no artistic talent. So to help us out with that, we also contracted local artist Chris Taylor, who did all of our concept art and 3D artwork, as well as local musician Liam Sauvé, who did all of the soundtrack for the game. Now, if you haven't heard of Keep Talking Nobody Explodes before, actually, maybe I'll just get a show of hands. Who has heard of the game? Okay, that's pretty awesome. Who has played the game, though? That is still pretty excellent. I'll run over this quickly anyway. The concept of the game is essentially that it's a cooperative puzzle-solving game. One person is playing a video game. Usually it's in VR. That's the person on the right. If you can see it there, he's wearing a VR headset. They are the diffuser, and they need to defuse a randomly generated bomb. Unfortunately, they have no idea what they're doing. To help them out, they have the experts. Let's move that mouse cursor. The experts are in the real world. They have a manual that they've either printed out or have brought up on their tablet or cell phone through our website. And this manual describes how to defuse every bomb combination possible. Unfortunately, they don't get to see this particular bomb. So each participant in the game has part of this crucial information, and together they have to communicate and work out which wires to cut, which buttons to push, in order to defuse the bomb before it explodes. Now, this talk is going to be the post-mortem for Keep Talking Nobody Explodes. And to me, a post-mortem covers things that went right, so decisions we made that went really well, things that didn't go so well, or could be called mistakes, things that went wrong, as well as things that we're sort of on the fence about, things that are confusing to us. That's a little girl hugging a hot water heater, thinking it's a robot. And these are things that, even with the benefit of hindsight, looking back at things that happened, we're still not ready to call right or wrong. Before we go any further, though, I will say that there is one caveat to this whole post-mortem thing. Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes is not dead. We worked on it full-time yesterday, and we're going to work on the game full-time on Monday. It's still very much a project that's ongoing. It's coming to new platforms. We're releasing updates. But it's still useful to take a look back at this point. And I want to just give you a quick overview, some numbers up front. The game is played in 5-minute rounds. They're randomly generated rounds, so you can play the game over and over again. But if you're looking for sort of a progression of difficulty, we do have 30 missions that you can play through in sort of a campaign mode, as well as a free play mode that lets you dial in a few settings and play the game the way you want to. The median playtime varies depending on which platform you're talking about, but it can be anywhere from about 40 minutes on some of the mobile headsets to about 2 hours on PC. We describe the game as an asymmetrical cooperative puzzle game, and if that's not enough genre keywords for you, we sometimes throw party in there as well. The team size was just the 3 of us working on it full time. The 2 contractors, Chris and Liam, we brought on to do bits and pieces here and there, but for the most part, it was the 3 of us, Brian, Alan, and myself. As far as platforms are concerned, we hit a lot of them. We launched the game on Samsung Gear VR, so that's a Samsung phone put into a Gear VR headset. We also released the game on PC and Mac, which doesn't require VR support at all. We do support VR headsets on PC, so we support the Rift and the Vive. We launched the game on PlayStation VR, and most recently we launched on Google Daydream. So we're on a lot of different VR headsets. For development time, it took us about 18 months to go from initial concept to that first launch on Gear VR. That was itself about 18 months ago, so put them together and we've been working on the game for over 3 years. And the ... is because we're still working on the game. The game is made in Unity, that's the engine that we use. And for the next one, I have to be a little bit hand-wavy to not violate any NDAs, but in kind of a vague, rounded fashion, I want to talk about sales. So across all platforms and all digital stores, at this point, last time I checked, we've sold over 500,000 copies of the game. So we've got a lot of people playing. And the last bit that I tend to forget about, because it's just part of our daily life, the game was made entirely in Ottawa. So for this post-mortem, I want to talk about the things that went right, wrong, and are confusing in 3 different categories. So I'm going to talk about design, technology, and then some of the business decisions we made. And I'll start with design, because that seems to be the one that people want to hear about the most. And we'll do the fun things first. What went right with design? This is a picture of us receiving the Independent Games Festival Award for Excellence in Design. And this is probably the thing that we are absolutely proudest of. It's our crowning achievement, really. Still can't believe that we actually won this thing. But we take it as a little bit of proof that what we ended up with was at least a pretty well-designed game. That's not a really useful reflection, though, so I wanted to look at some of the things we did to get us to where we ended up. And I think the most important thing we did was allow ourselves to find the game, to really discover what it was. If you didn't know, Keep Talking Nobody Explodes started as a game jam game. So it was a 48-hour thing where we got together and put together a quick prototype, and that was supposed to be the end of it. But it did mean that from the very beginning, we had this prototype, a working game that had some shred, some nugget of fun inside it. And it was so compelling that we wanted to take it all the way. We wanted to make it into a complete game. But we knew that it was a very long path from 48-hour prototype to shipped game. And we didn't pretend to know what that path would be. We didn't have a game design document up front. We weren't sure which direction this game was going to go in. So what we decided to do was take our game to lots of different conventions, lots of different conferences. We would work on the game a little bit and then bring it to a show like PAX. And we would show the game to people, get them to play it, get their feedback, get their, just observe them while they were playing it, figure out where they were having fun and where they were sort of experiencing pain points and not really getting what we were going for. And then we'd take all that feedback and we'd iterate on the game for a couple weeks and then take it to another convention. So over the years, we did things like OIGC here in Ottawa. We took the game to the Dirty Rectangles meetups. We went to a PAX, we went to Indiecade, we went to Oculus Connect, we went to more PAXs, there's lots of those. We went to PlayStation Experience, we went to E3, we went to South by Southwest. A lot of different conferences over the span of about a year and a half. And this is not a cheap way to make video games. But we did it for a couple of reasons. One of the most important ones was that we were making a VR game. And this was in 2014, 2015, and nobody had VR headsets. So there was no way we could get feedback on the game unless we brought our own headsets to players and actually physically put them on people's heads. So that was one reason for doing it. We felt that VR needed boots on the ground in order to get any sort of feedback. And one of the more selfish reasons for doing it is that we wanted to go to all of these conferences. We had been to things like PAX as attendees, and we saw exhibitors exhibiting their game, and we saw that they got to get in early and run their booth, and it seemed like a lot of fun. So we just wanted to be a part of that. And one of the unintended side effects of this, this idea of having conferences every month or every 2 months, is that it really structured our development. So we didn't get too far out of scope because you only ever had maybe 4 or 6 weeks between events. You could only do so much, and it really helped keep things on task. So I said we found the game. There were definitely a lot of things that we learned from doing these conventions, but here are a couple of important ones. The first one is that the game has a very wide appeal, a much wider appeal than we really anticipated. When we were going into this, we were very much focused on VR headsets, and we thought the people who would be interested in the game would be those who were interested in VR headsets. And they certainly were. They would come to our booth and play the game, but we found that they would bring along their friends. And what was notable is we found their friends would often say very vocally, "I'm not a gamer, I don't play games." And we could hand them the manual, and we said, "That's fine, that's not a game, you just need to help out your friend who needs to defuse a bomb." And they were okay with that because they could read and they could talk, and that was all we asked of them. And they would have fun playing the game. And then all of a sudden they would want to try the video game side of things. And so we found that there was just a much broader appeal than we anticipated. We also noticed that parents liked playing with their children because their children would talk to them. And children liked playing with their parents because they could boss their parents around. And it was just surprising to us because that wasn't something we had considered. And the other big thing we recognized is that the fun that people had really came from the communication that they were having between each other. they would get stressed out and they would get flustered. They would start making mistakes, they would start panicking, they would start blaming each other, but then they'd start laughing, and ultimately they would kind of persevere as a team. And we noticed that that's where they were having the most fun. If we had sat down right after that game jam and tried to dictate a direction for the game, I sincerely doubt we would have picked these sorts of things. But using these, we did the next thing that I consider a really good move on our part, and we established a thing that we called our design pillar. And to us, a pillar is just a single design goal upon which everything is built. Now, architecturally, this might be backwards because everything in the game actually supports the design pillar, but you get the idea. We have a single goal here. And the particular pillar is not really the lesson because this only applies to our game, but rather the benefits that we saw from having this sort of pillar. Now, ours is the phrase, foster interesting communication. So everything in our game should work towards fostering interesting communication. And if it doesn't, it shouldn't be in the game. And this allowed us to make decisions a lot more easily. If you think about it, our game is pretty weird. It's part digital VR bomb simulator, but also part printed paper manual thing. And it would have been very easy for those two games to just drift off in different directions and not really work together cohesively. But instead, we could look at any design decision and question whether or not it supported the idea of interesting communication. And that made it much easier to work together. We might have worked on separate things at different times, but we could know that each member of the team was working towards a common goal, and that really helped us out. But beyond just making it easier to collaborate, it also led to some pretty unintuitive conclusions. And not only did it lead to these unintuitive conclusions, but we were okay pursuing them because we knew that they supported our design goal. So even though they were unintuitive, we could still trust the results. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. The first is that Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes has really simple controls. If you haven't played the game, to interact with anything, you essentially just hover your mouse over it or highlight it in some way, and then push a single button. That's the only way you interact with the game. That will cut wires or push buttons or pull levers, do whatever you need to do. And that may sound like a pretty reasonable approach, but it's not a given that we were going to take that approach. Because Brian, Alan, and I are all game players. We're used to Xbox controllers. We can deal with a couple dozen buttons on a gamepad. And we're used to this sort of dexterity challenge, and we could have made the game really complicated to interact with. But we decided not to, because that doesn't make communication more interesting. Instead, we figured that the game should be about a team collectively coming to a very difficult decision, talking it out, and deciding what to do, and then having the individual execute that action very simply with little room for error. Because it's no fun if a team spends a lot of time coming up with what to do, and then a single person just hasn't used a gamepad enough, and then the team fails because they can't cut the right wire. That's not fun. Another kind of counterintuitive thing that came to us was the idea that defusing bombs is really just a scenario for us. It's a place where we can have tension for the players, but nothing beyond that. If you look at our game, there aren't really any violent or scary or realistic references. There's no mention of a bomber plotting against you. There's no imagery of explosives. Really, the worst threat that is levied against you is that you might explode. There's never any mention of death. And this is all really deliberate. We don't want to narrow our audience any more than we need to. And we found that players were happy enough to add on that sort of high-stakes gameplay if they wanted to. They could draw in pop culture. They could start creating their own backstory. We really didn't need to do that for them. But of course, not everything goes well in video games. If you can't read it, that's a Steam review that says trash and is thumbs down. So not everything went right with design, and here are a few that I picked out. One is the idea that our concept isn't friendly for Twitch. Nowadays, Twitch and YouTube are really big components of getting your game in front of a lot of different eyes. So having a game that works well for Twitch is kind of important. And initially, we thought our game would be great for Twitch, because it's all about communicating, and the player's personality really shines through. And if you watch Twitch streams, it's probably because you like hearing your favorite streamer talk. So this should actually work really well. But our game also relies on only having part of the information. And unfortunately, the thousands of people watching Twitch streams can watch the other Twitch stream and see all the answers to the puzzles, or they can look up the manual themselves, and suddenly Twitch chat becomes a source of cheating, essentially. And so for a streamer, the correct way to play the game is to ignore their own chat. And streamers are not likely to do that, quite rightly. So although we did have, thank you. Although we did have a bit of a splash on Twitch, it faded out pretty quickly. And I think that's just inherent to our design. It's a game where you can't have thousands of people watching both sides of things and expect it to be fair. The next problem was that we underestimated the intricacy of the manual. It's not important that you can read any of those titles there. Those are just little tasks from our task tracking system. They are all about fixing minor misunderstandings in the manual, and they are all from a single play test that happened pretty late in development. And this is basically the point. We were surprised at how many tweaks we needed to make very late into the project. It turns out that in order for players to have fun failing at the game, and we do expect them to fail and explode, but in order for them to blame themselves rather than the game, it's important that the manual be completely beyond reproach. It has to be unambiguous. It can't leave anything to chance. Unfortunately, the manual is written in English, and English is incredibly ambiguous. So it took us a really long time to try to hammer out a lot of those misunderstandings. What's worse about this one is that it makes us pretty wary of localizing the game in the future, because we spent a really long time trying to get it essentially good enough in English, and that's a language we do understand, and we designed the game. I don't know how we can outsource to a localization company that can understand our game well enough and will put in enough time to hammer out these sorts of problems. All right, and here's the last design failure that I want to talk about. This is the front page of our manual, and it contains a very grave error. It's highlighted there. It's where it says version 1. Now, we knew that our manual was very important to the game. It's essentially half of our game. It contains the rules for it. It's the game logic. And we knew that our game was procedurally generated, so there might be some combinations of things that we hadn't accounted for, we hadn't run into in testing. There might be mistakes, and the manual might need to be updated. So we came up with a system where we could essentially patch this manual that we have on our website. We could update the game, and the game would prompt you to prove that you have the latest version and make sure you have all of the fixes that we needed. So it was a great system, and I'm glad that we implemented it and we thought ahead. But where we blundered was by putting version 1 on the first version of it. We really shouldn't have called out that this was the first version. We could easily have put version 2 on the second one. But instead, we put version 1 on the front. And from this, players extrapolated a lot of different intentions and a lot of different motivations that we never had. We just wanted to be able to fix the manual if there was a problem. Unfortunately, they assumed that there would be new manuals coming, sometimes monthly, sometimes there would be new content, lots of free upgrades. They just imagined a lot of things that could be done based on this number. And it would have been really simple if we just omitted it, but we didn't, and we've been dealing with that ever since. All right, and then there's things that we're just not sure about. I'll take a risk here. So hands up if you've played Keep Talking before. Who's played? And then just all at once, can you shout out what your least favorite puzzle is? Just go for it right now. 1, 2, 3. All right, I heard Morse code over here. Perfect. That's really all I was looking for. One person saying Morse code. Now, if you're not familiar with this puzzle, it has a little blinking light on the top, and it flashes out short and long flashes in Morse code. And your role as the diffuser looking at this is just to communicate what you see, the shorts and longs. And then the experts have a table of Morse code. They can look up the word and tell you what it is. That's the entirety of the puzzle. Now, full disclosure, I'm the one who made this puzzle, so I recognize that I'm way too close to this subject to be impartial. But we get the most complaints about this puzzle. It is too difficult, everybody says. But it's intended to be difficult. Our game is intended to be hard. You're meant to explode a bunch. And what's more, this is a puzzle where it has a very simple concept, just explain what you see. And it happens to be really, really difficult to do that. It's hard to observe a blinking light and also say what it's doing while you're watching it. I'm not sure what part of human psychology that is, but it's an interesting phenomenon. Unfortunately, it's probably a bit too effective, and people get really frustrated by this puzzle. Now, I do firmly believe that removing this puzzle altogether is the wrong approach here. We've also made this puzzle as easy as we possibly could. There were earlier designs for it that were much more nefarious. But it feels weird to stand by a design that a lot of people complain about. So I'm not sure where we fall on this one. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the technology we used in the game and some of the things that went well for us here. The first was that we embraced virtual reality from the very beginning. Virtual reality in 2014 and 2015 was awesome. It was just free press everywhere you went. Everyone was willing to play your game. They would line up to try it. They didn't care what it was, but they would get in the door just to try out a headset. And then if your game was any good, they might be interested in it afterwards. But it was great to have this sort of free press. I will say that this offer has since expired, and if you have a VR game now, that's no longer good enough. But I think it's useful to recognize this fact. A post-mortem shouldn't be a blueprint for how to repeat success in the future. Instead, I think it's vital that we acknowledge these sorts of advantages that we had, especially the ones that aren't likely to apply in the future, like this one. Another thing that went really well for us was building the game with Unity. Unity allowed us to support a bunch of different platforms, like the Rift, Vive, Google Daydream, and PlayStation VR. It allowed us to launch on these platforms. We didn't get all of this support for free, despite what you may think. Unity is not just all checkboxes to add support for things, but it did enable it. And that's because Unity support often comes very early for new platforms. They invest a lot of money, or they get a lot of sponsorships, and it means that you can bring Unity to these new platforms fairly early on. It's not easy, but it's possible. And the other thing that Unity afforded us was the idea of making a non-VR game. Because Unity has been around for a while on PC, it's a pretty stable platform, at least when you're talking about non-VR. So we figured we could support that without too much trouble. We were actually so confident of this, we went into PAX Prime about 6 or 8 weeks before launch, and we announced that you could play the game without a VR headset. We hadn't actually implemented it at that point, but we were super confident that we'd be able to pull it off in the next couple of weeks. And this one stayed in the what went right column, so we were able to do it. But not everything went right. I mentioned that we launched the game on mobile VR. By that I mean Samsung Gear VR. And if you think of mobile VR as something like Google Cardboard, where you take just any old phone and stick it in a headset, you can be forgiven for thinking that mobile VR is terrible. But things like Google Daydream and Samsung Gear VR are actually fantastic experiences. They're also really, really demanding. And that's because you need to render the game at a super high resolution. You have to render it at 60 frames per second. At the time, you had to render everything twice, once for a left eye and once for a right eye. There were no sorts of optimizations. You weren't allowed to miss a frame throughout any of this, or else your players would become sick. And you're trying to do this all on a battery-powered cell phone from 2014. It was incredibly difficult to do this sort of thing. I'm doing it a bit of injustice by skimming over this, because we easily spent half our time optimizing the game for this cell phone as we did making the game, equal amounts of time. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but just know that it was a huge technical burden to get it to work. In fact, we spent about 6 months just getting the game to run properly on a cell phone, and just before we were about to launch, Android pushed out an update called Android Lollipop. And if anybody has worked for Samsung Gear VR in 2015, they are familiar with Android Lollipop because it reduced VR performance by about 20%. So we had worked ourselves to the bone to get this thing to work properly, and then the finish line was moved 20% further back. So feel free to talk to any of us about development of Keep Talking throughout the weekend. But if you bring up Android Lollipop, you might get kind of a dead stare from us. We will snap out of it. We did eventually get it to work. But this was just another couple months of arduous optimization. Another thing that I would say went wrong is the idea of Unity providing just instant free support for all these platforms. This is a look at all the different versions of Unity I have installed on my work machine just in about the past 6 months. So it's true that Unity can support all of these things, But what you might not know is that different pieces of hardware are a lot less finished, a lot closer to release than you might expect. Everything comes in very hot, it's very broken, things are being patched at the last minute, and it ends up that you need different versions of Unity for different platforms. Usually they're incompatible with each other, and it's not until months or years later that you can actually have one build that builds for everything. So instead you end up with a lot of different versions and you're managing them, and all of them have little performance regressions or bugs that need fixed, and you end up testing different installs of the game, and it's just a very slow and repetitive process. It's kind of the other side of this coin where, yes, the engine does everything for you, but you're at its mercy as soon as it's doing something incorrect. And all you can do is report a bug and hope it gets fixed, or else try to find some sort of workaround. And we spent a lot of time fighting different versions of Unity. Here's a puzzle called Rhythm Heaven. This puzzle is not in Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. We had to cut it. But we did prototype it. It is a functioning puzzle. It has its own rule set. It was tested, I think, in public maybe once. But unfortunately, this puzzle relies on pushing a button to a beat. So it's kind of like the game Rhythm Heaven or Guitar Hero, something where you just need to interact on the beat with music, essentially. Unfortunately, we found that on Android devices, there would occasionally be latency upwards of maybe a quarter of a second. And that made beat matching basically impossible. It was no fun to play, and it was not the player's fault. And since we were dealing with so many other technical problems, we essentially had to drop this puzzle entirely. We couldn't deal with the Android audio latency because it existed at a software and hardware level lower than we had access to. And our only real option was to either wait and hope somebody else fixed it, or just get rid of the puzzle entirely. So unfortunately, we put a bunch of work into this and we had to drop it, which was really disappointing. We have no idea how good a puzzle this is. It didn't go through enough testing, so it could end up actually being terrible. But it was pretty promising, and it's sad that it had to be cut. Now, the last thing that we did wrong is our use of analytics. So one question we get asked a lot, and I think it's a very fair question, is how many people play our game in VR versus non-VR? And that should be a really easy question to answer. And it's hugely embarrassing to say that we do not know, despite the fact that we did implement analytics in our game. We integrated Unity analytics, and we just haven't really figured it out. We haven't pulled enough data out of it in a meaningful fashion that we can make any decisions with our analytics data. And this is really just a failing because we went halfway, and we either should never have bothered implementing it in the first place, or more likely, we should have invested a bit more time to figure it out. But unfortunately, we just abandoned it. It kind of made sense at the time. When you're low on time, things get cut, and analytics just weren't that important compared to launching the game. But it is sad that we don't have answers to these questions. All right, what was confusing about our technology? This one was a little tricky to come up with, but the one that I settled on was our use of motion controls. So here's a very slow animated GIF of our Oculus Touch motion controls. So your hand controllers, where you can move your hand in space and interact with things. So we recently added support for Oculus Touch, as well as the HTC Vive controllers. And it's pretty great. It's neat that our game supports motion controls, because when you strap on a VR headset and you're interacting with its system menus using motion controls, it's nice that you can seamlessly stay in that space, keep the controllers in your hands, and continue playing on into our game. So that's really nice. Unfortunately, motion controllers came out well after our game had launched, well after it had been designed. And ultimately, when you give people their hands in VR space, they're going to want to do more with it. They're going to want to pick up wire snippers to cut wires. They're going to want to have screwdrivers to undo little bolts or screws and things like that. And unfortunately, that's at odds with our whole design philosophy. Remember, I talked about the idea of really difficult decisions that a group comes to, but then really simple input that leaves no room for error, or that people are not likely to screw up. Unfortunately, motion controls are kind of the opposite of that. They're often a little bit sloppy, and you should be able to have a bit of play in what you're doing. So I do think there's a really cool game somewhere down that path of dismantling electronics and reassembling them and messing around with different tools. I just believe that it's not our game, and it would have to be something else that was designed for that application. And that's why I'm not too sure where motion controls fit with Keep Talking. It's great that we have them, but it kind of hints at a different sort of game. All right, I'd like to get a bit serious here and talk about business. What went right with our business? I mentioned that Keep Talking started at a game jam. What I didn't say was that the reason Brian, Alan, and I worked together today, the reason that we started a studio and co-founded this company, was that we sat at the same end of the dinner table at the game jam. That meant we talked all throughout dinner, and we came up with an idea, and then we went over to the computer lab, and we started working together, and the whole thing really just spiraled out of control from there. But it wasn't necessarily clear that we would take this prototype and then start a company with it. It was something that we could have done lightly and then just ended up sputtering out. But instead, we decided to sit down right away and try to hammer out a collective idea of what success would mean to us. And this was important because if we were to pursue this project, we would have to risk our own time and our own money. And in Alan's case, he actually had to quit his job to do this thing. Hi, Alan. No small task to take this thing through. And so we decided to come up with this idea of what does success mean to us, to try to establish a context in which we could make decisions, whether it would be going to conferences or hiring people or buying new equipment, anything like that. We needed to make sure we were all on the same page. And importantly, we wanted to base it on things that we had control over. If we said success was winning a bunch of awards and selling 40,000 copies, unless we were giving ourselves those awards and buying those copies ourselves, it wouldn't be something we could control. And we wanted to make sure that regardless of what happened, we could be okay with the result. So here's what we came up with. This is paraphrasing a little bit, but these were essentially the three things that we formed our company on. The first was that we were going to explore this cool VR idea. The VR idea being Keep Talking, but also sharing an interest in this new emerging technology of virtual reality. We wanted to see where it went, and we figured that our goal would be basically to follow it and see what happened. Another key component would be that we would not invest a lot of money. This was important because we did not have a lot of money. We were willing to invest our time. It's notable that we didn't pay ourselves throughout this process, but we were okay with that. We were okay with investing our time and at the end of it getting nothing in the end. We weren't okay with the idea of investing our time and then coming out with a lot of crippling debt. So the agreement was that we would just not invest a lot of our own money. And the last thing, and this is true, we said we wanted to have fun along the way. So from the very beginning, we had this idea of going to conferences and exhibiting at PAX. We'd been gamers all our lives. We wanted to go to things like E3. We wanted to be a part of it. And we figured if we could work on a game in VR, not lose a lot of money, and maybe get to go to some cool conferences, we would call that a win. We'd be happy to walk away with that. Now, if you take all of these things, particularly number 2, not investing a lot of money, this is what it ends up looking like. This is Alan at his workstation. Alan gave me permission to use this photograph. He is working on a Microsoft Surface Pro 1, sitting on top of a cardboard box that he folded together every morning just to give it a little bit more height. He's working at the dining room table of my apartment, as we all did. And this is not something we're particularly proud of. It's not something we encourage, but this was our reality. This was the conclusion that we reached out of the idea of not wanting to spend a lot of money. Now, what he's sitting at is a 4-foot by 4-foot table. Usually 2 people would work here. Sometimes all 3 of us would. And when you're in that sort of confined area, especially for long hours at a time, you tend to get a little bit loopy, especially as the day wears on. There was one point where we were having a brainstorming session about what the backstory of our game should be. We needed to figure out what sort of environments we should be building, and we needed to know where the game was set. So the leading idea that came out of a day of brainstorming involved a train car, the Canadian government, and time travel. And we were supposed to be making a game about defusing bombs. Now, it's not to say that that idea doesn't have some merit to it, but it was safe to say that we should probably take a step back and recognize that we'd gotten a little bit unfocused. It was like this pretty much every day, and it got to the point where we could tell with reasonable accuracy what time it was based on how bad the ideas were being suggested. All right, the last thing that I would say we did right was our idea of this dev process going to conferences, doubling as marketing. This was not something that surprised us. We kind of planned it from the beginning. But all of the conventions we go to playtest, understandably, gets the game in front of a lot of different players. It also gets it in front of press, and so we would do interviews and try to get articles written about us, and we try to drum up interest from streamers and YouTubers. And the thing is, as the project wore on and playtesting became a bit less significant because the project was getting closer to completion, we kept going to conferences, and instead we just shifted our focus from feedback to promotion. And that ended up working pretty well for us. But we did make some mistakes along the way. It was hard to pick just a few of these. But one of the most important ones was the idea of community management and messaging. So for our game, we have a press kit, a website, a Facebook page, a Twitter account, a game dev blog, we have Steam forums, a subreddit, we have a mailing list. I'm sure there's a few I've forgotten. We have a Discord channel. But stop me if you've heard this one before. We were so busy working on the game, we didn't have enough time to do our marketing. That seems to be the classic indie pitfall. But we basically spread ourselves too thin. We tried to do everything, and in the end, what made sense to us was to abandon things or, at best, kind of underuse them. And I think we really could have benefited by picking just a few of these and doing a better job with them, rather than trying to follow all of the advice we heard saying that, yes, you need all of these things, and spreading ourselves so thin that it was just ineffective. The next thing we did wrong was to build a game and not a studio. And this one's a little tricky. This used to be under the what went right section, because this was definitely the right decision up until a point. It would allow us to stay focused and stay lean, not invest a lot of money. It was definitely the right idea. But at some point, we launched the game, and we did sell some copies, and we really should have started that shift. We should have switched to planning for the future. Yes, we still need to maintain our current project, but we should be positioning ourselves so that we can start prototyping new ideas and working on the next thing. I'm not sure when this point actually happened, but it's definitely sometime in the past. And the way we know this is by the question, what are you working on now? And our answer to this is still keep talking, nobody explodes. This used to be a big point of pride for us. After all, it's a good problem to have if your game still has players and it still makes sense to update it and bring it to new platforms. But lately, we've been getting a bit less proud that we're still working on this. Meanwhile, virtual reality is getting cooler and cooler and new stuff's coming out, and we're still working on the same game. All right, last section. What confused us about business? Well, everything confused us about business. But here are a few things. One is the idea of opportunities. We get a lot of cold emails from different companies that are propositioning us for lots of weird things. And we turn pretty much all of them down. But maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should pursue some of these things. After all, we don't do any sort of merchandising. We should probably sell t-shirts at the very least. Maybe we should make a board game version of our game. Maybe we should sell the movie rights. I don't know why Keanu Reeves hasn't made Speed 3 yet, but if he wants to do a collaboration, we should really look into that. Now, in all likelihood, we probably dodged a lot of bullets by not answering these emails, but there's probably something awesome in there that we've missed as well. And the only thing we know is that we didn't have the bandwidth to pursue any of it. Now, one other thing that's been bugging me lately is the idea that we may not have learned as many things as we could have learned. This is a screenshot of our PlayStation VR launch trailer. It was a live-action trailer that we did in collaboration with a group that does these sorts of things. It was filmed at the Diefenbunker. It's this kind of corny, cheesy thing where there's half live-action in the Diefenbunker trying to defuse a bomb, half in a living room playing the PlayStation VR version. It's pretty neat. But I have no idea if it was actually worth doing, other than it was a lot of fun to do. Was it worth the time or the financial investment? Is there something else we could have done instead? We really just don't know. And the troubling part about this, and what should really move it into the bad section rather than just confusing, is that we're still not in a better position to make these sorts of decisions. So we've gone through all the motions of making a live action trailer. If the next game comes up and we get to the point where we need to decide should we make another live action trailer, I don't think we have the data to go on to make that decision. We haven't really learned the lesson here. So I'm running out of time here, but that's okay. That's pretty much all I had. I'm going to try to wrap this all up. To sum it up, we had this good idea at a game jam. But from there, we worked to define a really conservative approach, a really conservative plan of attack so that we could pursue it. We then took this risk that we calculated, at least a little bit, and we put in the effort. We went to a ton of conferences, and we allowed ourselves to discover what the game could be. Along the way, we battled a lot of technical problems, but those honestly just come with the territory of working with new hardware and trying to be a launch title in a new medium. And now we find ourselves emerging on the other side. And at this point, we're learning that we need to recalibrate and figure out how to run a studio rather than just make a game. And honestly, doing this post-mortem has been a useful tool for us to reflect on some of the decisions we made and how we got to where we are. Hopefully there was something in here that was useful for you guys as well. A lot happens over a 3-year project. These are just a couple of excerpts. So if you see myself or Alan or Brian around the expo floor or reach out to us on Twitter, ask us any questions about this. I will say that Alan is also going to be on a panel about virtual reality later today at 4 o'clock, I think in the other room. And Liam, the musician, is going to be on a panel about audio tomorrow at 4:30. And that's about it for me. Thanks, everybody.